30 minutes after I gave birth to our daughter, I expected my husband to cry. I expected him to kiss her forehead and whisper that she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. I expected him to call his mother and tell her she was a grandmother. Instead, Ansel stood at the foot of my hospital bed, staring at the tiny swaddled bundle in my arms like she was a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room, and he said the words that would end the life I thought I was building. "I want a DNA test. That baby might not be mine." The machines beside my bed kept beeping in their steady, indifferent rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, another woman was laughing with her family. My own heart, I swear, simply stopped working for a few seconds. Not from heartbreak, not yet. From disbelief. I looked at my husband's face, searching for the punchline, some cruel joke that he'd take back the moment he saw how much it hurt. But his jaw was tight, his eyes were cold, and he wasn't joking. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I have spent 11 years working as a forensic accountant, finding the one number in 10,000 that doesn't belong, and something in me, some old, steady instinct, took over. I looked down at my daughter's face, memorized the shape of her nose, which was exactly Ansel's nose, and then I looked back up at him and said very calmly, "Fine. Let's do the test. But you're going to tell me right now where this came from, Ansel. Because 3 days ago you were painting a nursery with me. So somebody said something to you. Who was it?" He didn't answer. He just looked away, toward the window, toward the parking lot, toward anywhere that wasn't my face. And in that silence, I picked up my phone from the little rolling tray beside my bed, and I opened a note, and I started writing down the time, the date, and every word he'd just said. Because I already knew, somewhere beneath the shock, that I was going to need it. My name is Solène. This is the story of the worst 30 minutes of my life, and the months that followed, where I found out exactly who in my husband's family had decided my daughter and I were worth destroying. Ansel and I met the way unremarkable things become remarkable in hindsight, at a laundromat 2 blocks from my apartment, both of us annoyed that the dryer on the end ate quarters and gave nothing back. He made a joke about filing a formal complaint with the laundromat's board of directors. I laughed harder than the joke deserved, because I'd had a long week, and something about his voice made the week feel shorter. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony with folding chairs and string lights, the kind of wedding where the tears are real because nobody's performing for a camera crew. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Ansel was steady. Not flashy, not performative, steady. He remembered how I took my coffee. He drove 40 minutes out of his way every Sunday to bring his grandmother groceries. He was, by every measure I had, a good man. The one complication in our life together had a name, Georgette. Georgette was Ansel's mother, and she had never, not once, looked at me like I belonged in her son's life. She ran Ansel's late father's charitable foundation, the Wentridge Family Foundation, a modest but respected organization that funded scholarships for first-generation college students, and she ran it and her family with the same iron precision. She had opinions about everything, the flowers at our wedding, the neighborhood we bought our first house in, and especially the fact that I kept my maiden name for professional reasons. "It's confusing for people," she told me once at a Thanksgiving dinner in front of 11 relatives. "A wife who doesn't share her husband's name. It makes people wonder what you're hiding." I let it go. I let a lot of things go because Ansel loved his mother, and I loved Ansel, and I told myself that love sometimes means tolerating people who make your jaw ache from clenching it. There was the Christmas she misplaced the invitation to my parents so they wouldn't attend the family gathering, then acted wounded when I brought it up. There was the baby shower she insisted on co-hosting, only to fill the guest list with her own friends and seat my side of the family at a folding table near the kitchen. Individually, each moment was small enough to swallow. Together, they were a pattern I chose not to look at too closely, because looking at it honestly would have meant admitting my mother-in-law had never planned to make room for me, only to tolerate me for as long as it served her son's happiness. When I got pregnant, Georgette's tone shifted in a way I should have paid closer attention to. She started asking pointed questions about my work travel. I did quarterly audits for a mid-sized firm, which meant 2 or 3 overnight trips a year to client sites. She started asking about who I was really close with at the office. She started, in other words, laying bricks for a wall she hadn't shown me yet. I didn't think much of it. I was tired, I was nauseous, I was building a nursery in the color of sage green that Ansel had picked out himself. I didn't have room in my life to suspect his mother of anything more sinister than garden variety disapproval. The trouble started 11 days before I gave birth. Ansel came home from a Sunday dinner at his mother's house, one I'd skipped, citing exhaustion, which was true, and he was quiet in a way that didn't fit him. He sat at the edge of our bed and didn't take his shoes off for almost 10 minutes, just stared at them. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Just tired." That was the first lie. I know that now. At the time, I chalked it up to the particular exhaustion of spending 3 hours in Georgette's dining room, which could wear down anyone. For days later, he asked me, casually, too casually, while we were folding tiny onesies at the kitchen table, whether I'd ever kept in touch with that guy from the Denton audit. His name was Foster. I had worked with him for 6 weeks, 2 years earlier, on a client engagement in another state. We were colleagues. We were, at most, friendly in the exhausted, overcaffeinated way that people become friendly when they're both stuck in a windowless conference room until 9 at night. Foster? No. Why would you ask that? No reason, Ansel said, folding a onesie with more focus than the task required. I should have pushed harder. I didn't, because I was 36 weeks pregnant, swollen-ankled, and running on the kind of exhaustion that makes you choose peace over confrontation whenever you can. I filed the question away and told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was a seed. And someone had planted it very, very deliberately. I went into labor on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before my due date. Ansel drove me to the hospital with his hand on my knee the entire way, telling me I was doing great, that he loved me, that he couldn't wait to meet her. For 14 hours, he was exactly the husband I had married, holding my hand through every contraction, feeding me ice chips, telling the nurses jokes to keep the room light. When our daughter was born, he cut the cord with hands that were shaking, and for about 20 minutes, I thought I had imagined the strangeness of the last 2 weeks entirely. And then his phone buzzed. He stepped just outside the door to take the call, which I remember thinking was odd. Who calls 30 minutes after a birth? And when he came back in, his face had changed. He walked to the bassinet and looked down at our daughter for a long moment, and for a few seconds I watched something almost tender cross his face, like the man I married was still in there, trying to fight his way back to the surface. "I don't want to believe this," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. Then his jaw hardened, like he was closing a door on that better version of himself, and he said the words that split my life into a before and an after. "I want a DNA test. That baby might not be mine." I didn't get the full story from him that night. He wouldn't tell me who called, wouldn't tell me what was said, wouldn't tell me anything except that he needed to be sure. A nurse, Dinah, who had been kind to me all day, came back into the room not long after and found me sitting very still, my daughter asleep against my chest, my husband gone to get some air in the parking lot. Dinah didn't ask what happened. She just squeezed my shoulder and said, "You did beautiful today, Mom. Whatever's going on with him, that's his to carry, not yours." I held on to that sentence for the next 3 months like it was a life raft. Ansel didn't sign the birth certificate that week. In our state, a father has 30 days to formally establish paternity on the record if he wants to contest it, and he told me flatly, without apology, that he intended to wait for results before putting his name down. I sat in a hospital bed with a 6-hour-old infant and listened to my husband explain, in the calm tone of a man discussing a home warranty, that he wasn't sure he wanted to be legally connected to his own daughter yet. I did not argue with him in that hospital room. I had already decided, somewhere in that first icy minute, that I wasn't going to fight this the way he expected me to fight it, with tears, with pleading, with the kind of desperate reassurance that lets a manipulator feel like they've won something. Instead, I asked Dinah for a printed timeline of my labor and delivery, including the exact hour our daughter was born, and in the Notes app on my phone, with Dinah still in the room, I wrote down word for word exactly what Ansel had said and when he'd said it. I didn't know yet what I'd need it for. I only knew that a woman who documents things is a woman who can't be rewritten later. The hospital social worker, a soft-voiced woman named Bridget, stopped by the next morning under the pretense of a routine postpartum wellness check. I understood, from the careful way she asked her questions, that Dinah had quietly flagged something the night before. Bridget asked if I felt safe at home. I told her the truth, that I did, physically, but that my husband had said something in that room I doubted I'd ever fully forgive. She listened, reminded me gently that hospital support services were available in the weeks ahead if I needed them, and left her card tucked into my discharge folder. It wasn't an official record of what Ansel had said, but it was one more person who had seen my face in that moment and knew something wasn't right. We went home 4 days later, and the house didn't feel like the house I'd decorated a nursery in. Ansel moved into the guest room until things were sorted out. He was polite to me, unnervingly polite, the way people are polite to someone they've decided is no longer fully trustworthy. He helped with nighttime feedings out of some residual sense of duty, but he wouldn't hold our daughter for more than a few minutes at a time, like touching her too long might mean something he wasn't ready to commit to. I called my best friend Annalise on the third night home. Annalise worked in digital forensics for a regional law firm, the kind of job where she spent her days tracing spoofed emails and burner numbers back to the people foolish enough to think technology couldn't be unwound. She came over within the hour, took one look at my face and said, "Okay, start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." I told her everything, the questions about Foster, the phone call in the parking lot, the DNA demand. Annalise asked to see Ansel's phone, and when I told her he'd become oddly protective of it in the last 2 weeks, she got quiet in the way she gets quiet right before she finds something. "So Len," she said, "has anyone shown Ansel any kind of proof? A photo, a text, anything? Because an accusation this specific, this sudden, right after birth, that's not a guy having a random spiral. That's a guy who was shown something." I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd been so consumed by the humiliation of the accusation that I hadn't stopped to ask the more useful question, where did it come from? 3 nights later, I got my answer, though not from Ansel. I got it from his cousin Philippa, who had never much cared for Georgette's theatrics and who called me, quietly, to ask how I was holding up. "I probably shouldn't say anything," Philippa told me, "but Aunt Georgette's been showing people a printed photo. Says it's you and some man from your work at a hotel. She showed it to my mom at the Sunday dinner before you gave birth." Ansel wasn't even in the room yet when she started passing it around. My hands went cold holding the phone. "A photo of me. At a hotel." That's what she said. I asked Philippa if she'd seen it herself. She had, for about 4 seconds, before Georgette snatched it back into her purse like it was something precious. Philippa said it looked like me from behind, dark hair, my build, standing next to a man in a hotel lobby. She said something about it looked off, though she couldn't say exactly why. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my daughter's nursery, nursing her in the dark, running through every hotel lobby I'd stood in during the last 2 years. I thought of the Denton audit. I thought of Foster, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a year. And I thought of my mother-in-law, sitting at her dining room table, holding a photograph like a queen holding a court order. I didn't confront Georgette. Not yet. Confronting her would have meant tipping my hand before I understood what hand she was even playing. Instead, I did what I do best. I built a file. I asked Annalise to help me trace the timeline. The Denton audit had happened 2 years earlier at a hotel called the Faro Inn, in a city 300 miles from where I lived. If Georgette had a photo of me at a hotel, it had to have come from somewhere, either an old photo genuinely taken during that trip and now weaponized out of context, or something fabricated entirely. Annalise pulled a thread I hadn't even considered. 2 weeks before Ansel's accusation, an anonymous text message had been sent to his phone from a number with no caller ID, containing a photo and the message, "Thought you should know what she does when she travels. Ask her about Foster." Ansel had, out of what he later admitted was shame, deleted the original message, but not before Annalise, with his reluctant, guilt-ridden cooperation once I finally got him to sit down and talk like an adult, was able to pull metadata from a backup on his cloud account. The number traced to a prepaid phone, the kind that's designed to be a dead end for exactly this reason. Annalise could see it had been activated a little over 3 weeks before Ansel's accusation, at a drugstore 12 minutes from Georgette's house. That much was visible from the carrier's public activation window, but confirming who had actually walked in and bought it was beyond what either of us could do on our own without legal authority. "This is as far as we get without a subpoena," Annalise told me, turning her laptop toward me so I could see the activation timestamp glowing on the screen. "Somebody wanted a specific outcome on a specific timeline. We just don't have the power to prove who yet." I sat with that for 2 full days before I said anything to anyone, because the deeper question wasn't only who. It was why. Georgette had never liked me, but disliking your daughter-in-law and orchestrating a fabricated affair 30 minutes after she gives birth are two very different categories of cruelty. There had to be a reason with teeth in it, and I didn't have it yet. Just over 2 weeks later, the DNA results came back. Ansel was her father, obviously, undeniably, 99.99% her father, the same number every honest test in the world would have told him if he'd simply asked me instead of accusing me. He cried when he read it. He apologized. He told me he'd been an idiot, that he loved me, that he wanted to fix things. I want to be honest about something here, because these stories always tempt you toward a clean, satisfying ending, and this one didn't have one, not yet. I didn't fall into his arms. I looked at my husband, a man who had chosen to believe a stranger's fabricated photograph over 11 years of trust and a woman recovering from labor in a hospital bed, and I told him the truth. The test isn't the problem, Ansel. You believing it before you asked me, that's the problem. You let your mother make me a stranger in my own home for 2 weeks. I need you to understand that fixing this isn't about the results. It's about the fact that you were willing to throw me away on the word of an anonymous text and a doctored photo without giving me 30 seconds to explain myself. He didn't have a good answer. To his credit, he didn't try to manufacture one. I told him I needed him to find out, completely and honestly, where the accusation had come from, and to understand that if it led back to his mother, there would be no soft landing for her. Not this time. It took him 4 more days to admit what I already knew, because admitting it meant admitting his mother had used his newborn daughter as a weapon. When he finally confronted Georgette, she didn't deny it outright. She reframed it, the way people like her always do. I was protecting this family, she told him, according to what he relayed to me afterward, his voice hollow. I had a feeling about that woman from the start. I was right to look into it. What she hadn't counted on was that looking into it would eventually mean I'd start looking into her right back, even if it took me months to have the time and the proof to do it properly. For a while, the investigation had to wait, because a newborn doesn't care that her mother has a mystery to solve. Life shrank down to feedings and diaper changes, and the particular exhaustion of counting hours in 2-hour increments. It was almost 2 months before I felt like myself again, and even then, only in pieces, an hour here, a clear evening there, once my body and my sleep schedule had settled into something survivable. When I did start thinking clearly again, my forensic instincts came back before the rest of me did. In the evenings, after the baby was down, I'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop and pull a few pages of public records at a time. Nothing formal, nothing urgent, just the quiet habit of a woman who couldn't stop picking at a loose thread. Over the following weeks, a few pages became a pattern. The Wentridge Family Foundation, under its own charter, was required to undergo an independent compliance audit every 3 years, conducted by an outside firm the board selected, one with no connection to me or my employer, which meant I had no professional stake in what it found and no conflict of interest in looking at what was already public. That audit happened to be scheduled to begin the same week our daughter was born. I only learned the timing later, almost in passing, from Philippa. Working slowly over nearly a month of quiet evenings, I pulled the publicly available Form 990 filings for the foundation going back 5 years. What I found, even from public documents alone, was a pattern. Scholarship disbursements that had grown suspiciously administrative fee-heavy, a consulting line item paid to an LLC with no public footprint, and a board that hadn't rotated in 9 years, which meant no fresh eyes had looked closely at any of it. Digging further into public business filings, I traced the mystery LLC back to a registered agent address that also happened to be Georgette's own home. Georgette had, by every indication in the public record, been quietly siphoning funds from a scholarship foundation named after her late husband, funneling them through a shell consulting entity, for at least 3 years. And the independent audit that stood a real chance of catching it had been scheduled for the exact week her son's baby was born, the week I would be exhausted, distracted, and emotionally cornered, with a newborn and a collapsing marriage, least equipped to notice anything happening around me at all. I don't think Georgette orchestrated the affair accusation purely as a diversion for the audit. Some of it, I believe, really was her lifelong disdain for me curdling into opportunity. But I came to believe the timing wasn't a coincidence either. I think she calculated that a devastated, distracted daughter-in-law would either leave the family entirely within a matter of weeks, taking the scandal and any scrutiny with her, or would be too consumed by her own collapsing marriage to ever think about cross-referencing a nonprofit's tax filings. Either outcome bought her the one thing she needed most: enough chaos for long enough that the audit would come and go without anyone asking the right questions. She had, in her own cold arithmetic, decided that 30 minutes of my devastation was a fair price for a few more months of cover. I didn't confront Georgette myself. I let the audit do what audits are supposed to do. Once I had enough compiled, I brought everything to my own attorney, Thaddeus Kane. Rather than approaching the outside audit firm directly, I wanted whatever I'd found to reach them through a formal, disinterested channel, not as a tip from a daughter-in-law with an obvious motive. Thaddeus forwarded the public 990 discrepancies and the registered agent connection to the audit engagement partner, a meticulous woman named Isadora Blackwood, framed simply as information worth verifying early. Isadora pulled the thread herself over the following 2 months. What her team found was worse than what I'd assembled from public records alone: forged board authorization signatures, wire transfers to the Shell LLC totaling just under $200,000 over 3 years, and falsified meeting minutes designed to make an unauthorized transfer look approved. As part of that broader financial inquiry, the Foundation's attorney subpoenaed purchase and activation records tied to the same drugstore Annalise had flagged months earlier. Store surveillance footage from the activation date showed a woman using a card registered to Georgette's longtime personal assistant, a soft-spoken woman named Fenimore, the same woman, it turned out, who managed Georgette's photo archive, including years of family event photos where, yes, I had once stood beside Foster at a networking mixer that Ansel himself had attended. The hotel photo had never been a hotel at all. It was a cropped, filtered image from that mixer, edited to remove the banner behind us that named the conference. Someone had taken an innocent photograph and given it a new, poisonous context. Time to detonate in the 1 hour of my life. I'd have no strength left to defend myself. The Foundation's actual board, once shown Isadora's findings, did not hesitate. Georgette was removed as executive director within the week. The board referred the matter to their attorney, who, as is standard in cases involving apparent nonprofit fraud, reported the findings to the State Attorney General's Charity Oversight Division for further review. Georgette's response to being caught was, in its own way, the most honest thing she'd said in the entire ordeal. She told Ansel, during a phone call he later described to me word for word, "I did what I had to do to protect this family's reputation. Everything I've built." She never once said she was sorry for the photograph. Not to Ansel. Not to me. Not to a single soul as far as I know, to this day. I saw her exactly once during that period at Ansel's insistence, so she could say her piece before the board's findings became public. She sat across from me at her own dining table, the same table where she'd once told 11 relatives that keeping my maiden name made people wonder what I was hiding, and she folded her hands like she was the one owed an apology. "You went digging into my foundation," she said, "because you couldn't stand that I finally saw you clearly." "I went digging," I told her, "because you handed a stranger's photograph to a room full of people who love your son 30 minutes before I gave birth to your granddaughter, so that nobody would look too closely at your bank transfers. You didn't see me clearly, Georgette. You saw an obstacle. I just turned out to be a more thorough one than you accounted for." She didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time in 6 years of knowing her, Georgette had run out of a version of events that made her the injured party. I stood up, straightened my daughter's blanket, and left without waiting for a response I already knew wasn't coming. I want to tell you the marriage healed cleanly, that Ansel and I sat by candlelight and forgave each other and raised our daughter in some unbroken storybook piece. That isn't what happened, and I think it's more useful to you, whoever's watching this, to hear the truth. I loved my husband. I still do. In the complicated way you love someone who failed you in a moment that mattered more than almost any other moment of your life. But love was never the question. Trust was the question, and trust doesn't return just because a DNA test comes back the way it should have all along. I told Ansel I needed space. Not a symbolic, performative kind of space, but real distance. I moved with our daughter into Annalise's guest room for 6 weeks while he stayed in our house alone, and I made it clear that any path back to a shared home ran through consistent, demonstrated change, not apologies. He went to individual counseling on his own, without me managing his appointments for him, which was the first thing he'd done in this entire ordeal that felt like it belonged to a man taking responsibility rather than a man managing an image. He wrote me a letter during that time, not a text, not a rehearsed speech over dinner, but an actual handwritten letter, laying out, in plain terms, every place he'd failed to protect me and why he'd chosen fear over faith in the one relationship that had never once given him a reason to doubt it. I kept the letter. I haven't decided yet whether I'll ever tell him that. I also made one thing non-negotiable, and I told him so directly. Georgette would have no unsupervised access to our daughter, and for the foreseeable future, no access at all. Not out of spite. Out of the plain fact that a woman who would use a newborn as cover for financial fraud is not a woman I trust around that same newborn's future. Ansel didn't fight me on it. I think, by then, even he understood there was nothing left to argue. Georgette, for her part, was formally charged several months later with several counts related to nonprofit financial misconduct, following the Attorney General's review. I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard. I felt something like the quiet, unglamorous satisfaction of watching a spreadsheet finally balance after weeks of hunting down a single stubborn error. She had spent her life believing her name and her composure would insulate her from consequence. They didn't. Ansel and I are still working through what our marriage is going to be. I won't tell you we're back to where we started, because I don't think either of us wants to go back to where we started. That version of our marriage had a blind spot in it big enough for his mother to walk through with a fabricated photograph and nearly destroy everything we'd built. What we're building now is slower, more honest, and entirely mine to walk away from if it stops being safe. I kept my name. I kept my daughter's trust fund entirely separate from the Wentridge family's, drawn up by my own attorney, with language no one will ever be able to quietly rewrite again. And I kept, above everything else, the version of myself that didn't scream in that hospital room, the one who picked up her phone instead and started writing everything down. My daughter is 9 months old now. She has Ansel's nose and my stubbornness, and someday, when she's old enough to understand it, I'll tell her this story, not as a warning about her father, but as a lesson about the exact moment I learned that the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes need to be investigated instead of trusted, and that the strongest thing you can do in the worst moment of your life isn't to scream. It's to keep a record. So here's my question for you. If the people closest to you believed a stranger's fabricated story over your own word, in the most vulnerable moment of your life, would you fight to rebuild what was broken, or would you already be building your way out the door? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Valira Payback, and share your thoughts in the comments.